the action, the implementation of the directions and guidelines that the Lord had instilled concerning sacrifice
Right.
and consecration of the priests.
Mm-hmm. So they went through this week-long ordination, right? And then on the 8th day, they had the inauguration of the tabernacle. So the 8th day it's D-Day. This is the day when everything starts, when all of that sacrifice finally starts at the tabernacle. How did it go?
It went swimmingly, didn't
It did. Do you remember that there was something that kept getting repeated in that chapter? They did everything the way the Lord commanded.
Mm-hmm.
So it went swimmingly because they were doing everything exactly the way the Lord had commanded them to do it. And it kept telling us that over and over, that Moses was following the commands of the Lord. So he started by having Aaron give an offering for his sins. So you remember he had a purification offering and a burnt offering for himself, because the high priest, of course, has to be purified before he can represent the people. And then he brought all of these offerings on behalf of the people. So we got remember that whole variety of sacrifices that were brought? I think because this is a unique day, because this is the inauguration day of the tabernacle it's unique, and you get that picture in just a whole variety of sacrifices. Then he brought all the sacrifices for the people. Then what? What happened after that?
The glory of the Lord appeared,
Mm-hmm. Yes,
and the people bowed down and worshiped him.
that's right. Gave this benediction. The glory of the Lord showed up. What did the glory of the Lord look like? Fire. And you remember how it said it came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the sacrifices that were on the altar? That language is important because it really should be the people who get consumed, but it's not, because it's the sacrifices that get consumed. And all of that demonstrates that the Lord has accepted their worship, and that he's welcomed them into fellowship with him through a priest and a sacrifice. And they fell down on their faces and they worshiped him. And they lived happily ever after the end.
Next
That's right.
chapter.
That's right. Now, you'll notice, we're going to read through this in just a second, but you might notice at the beginning of chapter 10, there's no transition. And I think the reason for that is because the chapter break is a little bit inconvenient. The reason is it just continues on straight from what happened in chapter 9. This is not a different day. It's not even a different time. So chapter 10 follows immediately after what happened in chapter 9. We're on the same day with the same sacrifices. Everything just happened. This is still inauguration day at the tabernacle, and we know that actually from verse 19. And we'll talk more about that as we go through. But still, inauguration day of the tabernacle, and that's when all the action happens that happens next in chapter 10. Okay, so let's read chapter 10. Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers, put fire in them, and added incense, and they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Moses then said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord spoke of when he said, 'Among those who approach me, I will show myself holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored.'" Aaron remained silent. Moses summoned Mishael and Elzaphan, sons of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come here, carry your cousins outside the camp away from the front of the sanctuary." So they came and carried them still in their tunics outside the camp as Moses ordered. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not let your hair become unkempt, and do not tear your clothes, or you will die, and the Lord will be angry with the whole community. But your relatives, all the house of Israel, may mourn for those the Lord has destroyed by fire. Do not leave the entrance to the tent of meeting, or you will die, because the Lord's anointing oil is on you." So they did as Moses said. Then the Lord said to Aaron, "You and your sons are not to drink wine or other fermented drink whenever you go into the tent of meeting, or you will die. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. You must distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean, and you must teach the Israelites all the decrees the Lord has given them through Moses." Moses said to Aaron and his remaining sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, "Take the grain offering left over from the offerings made to the Lord by fire, and eat it prepared without yeast beside the altar, for it is most holy. Eat it in a holy place, because it is your share and your son's share of the offerings made to the Lord by fire. for so I have been commanded. But you and your sons and your daughters may eat the breast that was waved and the thigh that was presented. Eat them in a ceremonially clean place. They have been given to you and your children as your share of the Israelites' fellowship offerings. The thigh that was presented and the breast that was waved must be brought with the fat portions of the offerings made by fire, to be waved before the Lord as a wave offering. This will be the regular share for you and your children, as the Lord has commanded. When Moses inquired about the goat of the sin offering and found that it had been burned up, he was angry with Eleazar and Ithamar, Aaron's remaining sons, and asked, "Why didn't you eat the sin offering in the sanctuary area? It is most holy." It was given to you to take away the guilt of the community by making atonement for them before the Lord. Since its blood was not taken into the holy place, you should have eaten the goat in the sanctuary area as I commanded. Aaron replied to Moses, "Today they sacrificed their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord, but such things as this have happened to me. Would the Lord have been pleased if I had eaten the sin offering today?" When Moses heard this, he was satisfied. Okay, so just to clarify, all those sacrifices that he's talking about in that section are the sacrifices that were just offered in chapter 9, right? So we're just carrying on with the action now. How does chapter 10 open in verse 1?
Immediately they had a better plan.
Yeah. What did they do? Well,
Might by both and
They went all
strange
Catholic.
fire.
Yeah.
They went all That was funny. She said they went all Catholic on
They
them.
went all Catholic on it.
That was really good. I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so who first of all, who are these two guys who get mentioned? Nadab and Aaron. They're Aaron's sons, and Nadab was the oldest, which means that he's the one who's in line to someday become the high priest. So this is a guy who should know what he's doing, right?
Especially since they had just gone through it for 7 days.
Yeah. Nobody can claim ignorance right here,
No,
right?
they can't.
And not only because of all that ceremony they've gone through for the last week, but these men were present when the covenant was made on Mount Sinai. They saw the fire of the Lord on the mountain. They've been involved in all the goings-on that have been happening. So here they are, after a week of ordination ceremonies on the day when worship finally starts at the tabernacle, and they take their censers. You know what that is?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Anybody that's been.
I was going to say that's why what makes you think of that, isn't it? Is and censers can be formed differently. So sometimes they'll hang on a chain. You can also have them as part of like a statue or something that looks a bit like a candle holder, but basically it's a place where you put a coal or an ember in it, and then you add incense to it to make it smoke. So it can be stationary or it can be something that you carry around. So that's the idea when it says they took this censer. They put fire in it, which would have been a charcoal or a glowing ember. They add incense to it, but there's a problem because it is strange fire, which means it's deviant or it's unauthorized. Okay, now, why would it say that? Isn't fire just fire?
No.
Why not?
Well, there obviously has to be a difference between this fire that just consumed the sacrifices and the fire that man has lit.
And you notice at the end of verse 1 that it says the problem is it's contrary to the Lord's command,
Mm-hmm.
right? So remember how in the last 2 chapters, we kept seeing it repeated as the Lord commanded, over and over and over. Every detail was according to the Lord's instructions. Right here is the first time in all this ritual that someone does something contrary to what the Lord commanded. And knowing how particular the Lord's been about all these things, you should be expecting the sparks to fly. And that's exactly what happens when they do something. Not just anybody, but when the priests do something that's contrary to what the Lord commanded. Okay, now the text right here doesn't tell us exactly why the fire was out of line, but chapter 16 gives us a couple of hints, I think. So let's turn over real quick to the chapter 16, which is about the Day of Atonement. This is all the instructions for what they do. The one day of the year when the high priest actually goes into the most holy place. So I'm going to read chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, and then I'm going to skip down and read verses 12 and 13. So, 16, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron who died when they approached the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron not to come whenever he chooses into the most holy place behind the curtain, in front of the atonement cover on the ark, or else he will die. because I appear in the cloud over the atonement cover. Okay, now, the logical conclusion, I think, from those verses is that the two sons of Aaron had the intention of entering the most holy place. Although it's not clear how far they got. It doesn't look like they got very far at all. But they seem to have been assuming that they could just go where they wanted inside the tabernacle. And then, look down at verses 12 and 13. Actually, start in verse 11. Aaron shall bring the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household, and he is to slaughter the bull for his own sin offering. He is to take a censer full of burning coals from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense, and take them behind the curtain. He is to put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the smoke of the incense will conceal the atonement cover above the testimony, so that he will not die. Now, there's some very specific instructions right there for how Aaron's supposed to use the incense as he approaches the Lord in the most holy place. And did you notice too that it told him where to get the fire?
Yeah.
Where does he get it from? The altar. Now, I don't know where the sons of Aaron got it from, but it kind of sounds to me like the sons of Aaron are just trying to go into a place where they're not allowed, at a time when they're not allowed, by a means that they decided for themselves. And all of that is contrary to the Lord's command. So not good. And this on day 1 of the tabernacle being used for worship. Now, I doubt very much that these 2 men were being flippant or rebellious. I think they were just doing what religious leaders did in the ancient Near East. This is how worship services were run. This was what was familiar to them, and so they did it. But the danger of the Lord's holiness has been very clearly communicated. They've heard the warnings, and they know how perilous it is to approach the Lord. So what were they thinking? Why did they do it? Well, we'll come back to that in a second. Okay, now what happens then in verse 2?
They were consumed.
By what?
By the Lord's fire.
Now, I wonder if you notice that there's an intentional parallel between this verse and chapter 9, verse 24. So chapter 9, verse 24 said, fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions on the altar. Now the fire comes out from the presence of the Lord and it consumes the priests. Now, that doesn't mean that they just went up in smoke, as we'll see in a minute. Their bodies are still there, their clothes are still there. But it means the Lord executed them by fire, and I think the reason it describes it that way is because you're supposed to see the parallel between them and the sacrifice. Essentially, they became the sacrifice. When they got executed, they're being consumed instead of the sacrifice. And it takes like 2 minutes for this really dramatic reversal to happen, for this celebration by the people to just turn into a total calamity. Because the Lord is newly accessible, but not freely so. The fact that you have access to him now doesn't mean that he's not still a consuming fire. He is, and approaching him has to be done according to his command. Okay, now, why did all this happen? What does Moses say in verse 3?
This is what the Lord spoke of when he said, among those who approach me, I will be proved holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored.
So, here's why that just happened. Among the priests, and anybody who approaches the Lord, but specifically right here, the priests, the Lord has to be treated as the holy God that he is. If they don't take that seriously, he will show himself to be holy when his holiness breaks out against them. That's what just happened. Is either they make clear his holiness by the way they treat him, or he will make clear his holiness when he consumes them. And second, he says, in the sight of all the people, he must or he will be glorified. And again, if he isn't given the glory that's due him, he will show himself to be glorious when his glory breaks out against the people. So whether they submit to his commands or not, his holiness and his glory are going to be displayed. I mean, miracles of mercy and miracles of judgment both demonstrate the Lord's holiness and glory. Whether the people experience mercy or judgment depends on how they relate to the Lord. But he's going to make it clear who he is. And if they want to be on the right side of him, and they should, they have to do what it is that he commands, because his holiness will consume them if they don't. So right here, the Lord's issuing a really strong warning to the people and specifically to the whole priestly family. If they don't set him apart by their actions as a God worthy of reverence, he's going to use their death as an opportunity to remind all the people that he is the one to be revered above all. If they don't fear him, he will give them a reason to fear him, and it will be deadly. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Why is the Lord so lenient today with us?
We'll come back to that.
Okay.
Okay. Now, what's Aaron's response?
He's silent.
He remains and held his peace.
That's right, because, well, you notice too, there's a contrast again between the joy of the people when the fire appeared at the end of chapter 9, and now just the silence in chapter 10, because honestly, what's there for Aaron to say?
Yeah, he was pretty disappointed.
There's no argument for him to make, right? It's not like he's going to argue with Moses or the Lord. His son should have known better. They didn't approach a holy God according to the way he commanded, and they paid the price when his holiness broke out against him. Well, we talked about this before when we looked at the sacrifices. People don't decide the terms for how they're going to approach the Lord. He decides the terms because he's the one who provides the means of atonement.
This was shortly after the golden calf, right?
Yeah, I don't know how long it was, if it was a matter of weeks or maybe a few months, but certainly with
Within
less than a
memory.
year. Yeah.
Well, he was remembering what happened then.
Yep. Yep. Okay, now what are the instructions that Moses gives them then in verses 4 and 5?
Brought in the cousins.
Yes. Now, these are the sons of his and Aaron's uncle. Why them? Because they're Levites, but they're not priests. Now that matters
Okay,
because...
now wait a minute, they're Levites, but they're not priests?
Right. So the tribe of Levi has been set aside as the people who have responsibility at the tabernacle and later at the temple. So the Levites as a tribe, they do a whole lot of the practical work in the courtyard of the tabernacle. But it's only within that tribe, it's only the descendants of Aaron who are priests, right? So all of the priests are Levites, but not all of the Levites are priests. Because in order to be a priest, you have to be specifically descended from Aaron. So Moses too is a Levite, but his descendants cannot be priests because it's only Aaron's descendants who can be. So these men would have been Levites who have they're responsible for practical work at the courtyard, but because they're not priests, it's not an issue for them to become unclean the way it is for the priests. So these are the logical guys to do the cleanup work now in the courtyard of the temple, of the tabernacle. If the other priests had done it, it would have made them unfit for service right after that ordination and just at the moment when the tabernacle worship was getting underway, that would have just added to all the disaster. So Moses tells his two cousins to come and take the dead bodies away. And where does he tell them to take them?
The camp.
Now, where have we seen the mention of that things being taken outside the camp before?
When the hide and the stuff, the offal was burned up, it was
Yep.
carried outside the camp.
The leftover bits of the sacrifice. Which again is why I think you're getting this image of the fact that the priests, because they approach God wrongly, they end up becoming the sacrifice. And that's how they're treated. So they're taken outside the camp, away from the front of the sanctuary. And verse 5 says, when Moses tells them to do it, they do it. They carry the men out of the camp, still in their tunics. When I read that, it made me wonder if they're carrying them by their clothes. I don't know. But at any
Well,
rate,
I
yeah.
had a question about that too, because so it's a bit, it says that they were consumed by fire.
Wouldn't their tunics be burned up?
Yeah.
Because again, I don't think the word consumed is because they went up in smoke. I think they uses the word consumed in order to draw the parallel to the
Okay.
end of chapter 9.
Okay.
So basically when he says consumed by fire, what he means is he executed them.
Uh-huh.
But not necessarily that
Okay.
everything got incinerated.
Okay. But even that being said, when the sacrifice is consumed on the altar, we are seeing parts of it left there that are carried outside the camp.
Right.
So when I read that, I thought it was the guys carrying them out that were in their tunics.
Oh.
And I thought, what? I thought it was the guys that were
There's
carrying
a
out their
picture I
tunics.
can't unsee.
Yeah, yikes. I'm mine works. Thank you.
They've got their priestly clothes in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not a throwaway verse that they do what they've been told. Because after what just happened with the two sons of Aaron, it matters that these men do exactly what Moses tells them to.
Yeah, and we had talked before about the ashes, you know, being dumped outside the camp and
Mhm. Yep.
wind possibly blowing them away or whatever, you know, so that was why I kind of saw that too, was them being consumed by the fire, and you think they were the ashes. You know, they'd be blown away too.
And they will be eventually, but they're not ash yet.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, what are the instructions then that Moses gives to Aaron and his sons in 6 and 7?
They're not to mourn.
Mm-hmm. And what does he say specifically? Because he doesn't say you can't be sad. What does he tell them they can't do?
Don't let your hair become unkempt and don't tear your clothes.
Okay, now, what's going on right there? Well, this is a typical mourning ritual in the ancient Near East. So after the death of a loved one, it was normal for people who were related to them or who knew them well to enter into this period of formal grieving where they would become ritually impure. There were certain things that they did that made them ritually impure. One of the things that was typical of that kind of grief, and you see this other places in Scripture, is that people would tear their clothes and they would let their hair go. Now, what is it that Aaron and the other two priests are wearing right now?
Their priestly garments.
So what's the problem if they tear their clothes?
It destroys the priestly garments.
Mm-hmm. And in order for them to let their hair go, they have to remove the turban that's part of their uniform, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you remember the high priest in particular has a turban with that gold plate on the front that says holy to the Lord. If they tear their priestly clothes and they take their part of their uniform off, why does that matter?
Well, God put it on them, basically,
For what purpose?
to set them apart from the others, to
In order
show
then, Mhm.
their authority and their consecration.
Right.
So they could come near to the Lord.
Right, in order for them to be able to mediate for the people, right? So if they tear their clothes and they remove part of their priestly garment, what happens to the nation?
The nation becomes
Did,
unclean.
did you notice what he said in verse 6? Don't let your hair become unkempt and don't tear your clothes or you will die and the Lord will be angry with the whole community. Why? Because these are the men who now are the mediators for the nation. If they stand there in the courtyard of the tabernacle and defile themselves by tearing their priestly clothes and removing the turbans from their heads, that has implications for the whole nation because the nation suddenly loses their mediators. Woo! And now the whole of Israel is on the wrong side of the Lord because of what the priests do. So the point is not that Aaron and the rest of his family can't be sad. The point is that they cannot defile themselves by participating in those kind of mourning rituals because that has implications for the whole nation. That you lose the intermediary on the first day of worship at the tabernacle if the priests just do what people normally do when they go through a mourning process.
So they can leave when their duties are finished, they can go do their mourning in private. We've had an incredible show of an object lesson here, but they can still mourn, that won't be prohibited. It's just where they can mourn and how they can do that.
And when you can do it, yeah, and we'll actually come back to this, I think it's in chapter 22, where it has a whole list of instructions for the priest and in particular for the high priest, and what he's allowed to participate in when it comes to mourning and what he's not, and who he can do that for and who he can't, because his position is so important. I mean, think about not just the priest, but of the high priest and all the symbolism of what he's wearing. If Aaron as a man decides to tear the high priestly clothes, the weight of that symbolism is just like, it's kind of breathtaking to just tear apart all that stuff that the Lord has put on him to make it clear that he is the main one mediating between God and the people.
He'd be the next one consumed.
He would, absolutely he would.
He would what? Be the next one consumed by fire.
I mean, in a certain sense, if you've been given the privilege of being the priest, there, right now, you gotta step up. And you have to prioritize the well-being of the people over your own grief. You have to think about your position and the fact that you can't just say, I need a 10-minute break. Because you're the intermediary between God and the people, and the priests have to take that very seriously.
I was wondering about grieving for the loss of the 2 sons. Just kind of skipped over it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's, and I've heard some people say, well, they can't be sad because that would imply that, that God was wrong in his judgment. I don't think that's the case, because the rest of the nation is allowed to mourn. And because you also see all kinds of places in Scripture where the prophets, for example, mourn for the people of Israel while agreeing with the judgment that's coming. Even Jesus does that when he mourns for the city of Jerusalem. But the judgment is right. So I think it's possible for them to be sad, even to cry, to be upset about it, and yet it's not okay for them to defile the symbols of their consecration, the symbols of them being set apart as the mediaries between the Lord and the people. They can't do that, because then worship at the tabernacle stops right there. That there's nobody to mediate for the people if they do that. So that verse just stands, I think, as a strong reminder to the priests of just the great responsibility they bear as the people's leaders. And it's not only that they can't tear their clothes, they're not allowed to leave the courtyard of the tabernacle or they'll die. And he gives the reason, because the Lord's anointing oil is on them. They've been consecrated, they've been set apart as holy. And that holiness now determines what they do next. How do the priests respond at the end of verse 7?
Okay.
They obey. Whew! That's good, right? Not a throwaway verse. It matters that the priests do what Moses commanded them to do. All right, now, what does the Lord then say to Aaron in verses 8 to 11?
Do not drink wine of fermented drink when you go to the tent of meeting, or you'll die.
Right.
You must distinguish between the holy and the common, between unclean and the clean. And you must teach Israelites all the decrees that was given to Moses.
Yeah.
He gave to Moses.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now this is the first time the text records the Lord speaking directly to Aaron. And when he speaks to Aaron, the first thing he tells him is that he and his sons are never to drink wine or anything else alcoholic when they go into the tent of meeting, or they will die. Why do you think he threw that in the middle of this chapter? Is that just a random, oh, and by the way, I have an extra rule for you.
Maybe they drink a lot of fermented liquid.
Is it because of yeast?
I think because they have to have their minds clear.
Yep.
What she said,
Mhm.
Speaking from experience, when you drink too much wine, your
Yeah.
thinking gets a little cloudy.
It does. And I'm not positive, but remember back at the beginning when it was like, why in the world did those two men do that?
It might have been done.
Maybe.
Maybe.
The text doesn't say it, but it's a possible
Okay.
reason right
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Because wine was the common drink of the day. It was particularly drunk during a religious festival. So you would assume on inauguration day at the tabernacle, there were probably a lot of people who had wine. There was a big celebration. And it's not like you even have to be thoroughly drunk to have your judgment impaired, right? So, and however dangerous that is when you're driving, it's way more dangerous when you approach a holy God. Okay, now we can't be certain because the text doesn't say it explicitly, but perhaps that's why these two men did what they did, because they lacked the discernment of being completely sober. Now, even if that wasn't the case, the Lord still sets this down as a permanent rule. No drinking wine before you enter the tabernacle. For pagan priests, drinking yourself silly was just part of the course, but for the priests of God, it cannot be that way. And the reasoning he then gives in verses 10 and 11, because the priests are the ones who are on the hook for rightly distinguishing between the holy and the common, the clean and the unclean. They're the ones who are responsible for rightly teaching the law of the Lord to the people of Israel. So in other words, the priests need to have all their wits about them in order to do this work that the Lord has given them. if it's that dangerous to approach the Lord, you had better be completely sober. Like, don't come to the tabernacle without being completely sober, because bad judgment in these things could end up costing the priests their lives, and it could also end up costing the Israelites their lives, because remember who the priests are representing. And it's not just when you enter the tabernacle, it's if you're going to distinguish between clean and unclean. We'll get to this in a couple weeks with like the skin diseases. It's the priest who distinguishes between what's clean and unclean. If he makes a mistake in that, there are huge consequences for the Israelites if the priest messes that up. Now, I don't know if you remember in Isaiah, there was a particular chapter where Isaiah was laying into the priests for being drunk. Specifically because how can the priests lead the nation if they're just drinking themselves silly all the time? They can't. And here it's just, they have to be serious about these things, that you cannot approach the Lord if you're not fully sober, because it's too dangerous for you and for the people that you represent.
Sally, our pastor in Mosier, said he had chosen not to drink it ever anymore, because if he's home and gets a phone call and somebody needed his help, he didn't want to have to say, oh gosh, I probably shouldn't be on the road right now. And that has just stuck with me, and that's kind of what you're alluding to with this.
That it's not that the Lord doesn't say no wine allowed at a public celebration. He says if you're the priest, yeah, like this, you have to take this seriously. Yeah. Okay, now, what are the instructions that Moses gives to Aaron and his sons in 12 to 15?
Take the grain offerings made to the Lord by fire and eat it, prepared without yeast, beside the altar, for it's holy. Eat it in a holy place. Your sons and daughters may eat the breast, was waved to the, I can't remember writing it, thigh that was presented.
Mm-hmm.
The thigh and breast must be brought with fat portions of the offering made by fire before the Lord as a wave offering.
Yeah. So right here, Moses is giving, he's giving Aaron and the remaining two sons instructions about eating their portion of the offerings that were just used in the inauguration ceremony. So you've got all of these sacrifices they just offered. What do they do with the meat? So here he tells them. So that would include the purification offering, the grain offering, and the fellowship offering. Not the burnt offering, of course, because that's the one that's completely consumed. But he starts with the people's grain offering. That's the tribute that accompanies the burnt offering, and because it's most holy, and because the Lord has given it to the priests as their share of the food offerings, they're commanded to eat it, but they have to eat it in the courtyard of the tabernacle. Again, food offerings that are most holy can only be eaten by holy people in a holy place. So the priests are the only ones who can eat it, and it has to be eaten in the courtyard. And then in verse 14, Moses addresses the fellowship offering, which you remember is different because it's holy, but it's not most holy. So this offering has specific portions. We saw this back in chapter 7. There are these specific portions that are designated for the priest who makes the offering, as well as for the priests generally. So the priests' families are allowed to eat this meat, but they have to do so in a place that's ceremonially clean. Not necessarily holy. They don't have to eat it in the tabernacle of the courtyard, but they have to eat it in a place that's ceremonially clean. So when the Israelites bring their fellowship offerings, of course the fat portions, the breast, the thigh, are all offered to him, and then the fat portions are burned on the altar, but the breast and the thigh are given back to the priests as the provision for them and their families. So all those instructions have actually been given before. We saw that in chapter 7, chapter 6, and 7. Why do you think Moses repeats it all right here?
People have a tendency to forget.
Or they're slow learners.
That's right, and I would suspect after what just happened, that Moses wants to make very sure, like really, really sure. That's right. He wants to make sure the priests handle the Lord's holy things just the way they've been commanded. I mean, 2/5 of the priests are gone now, and they can't afford to lose anymore. So it's really important that they follow the Lord's instruction in how they deal with the bits that are left from the people's sacrifices. Okay, now I mentioned before there are 3 offerings the priests are allowed to eat. So we saw the grain offering, and we saw the fellowship offering, but we didn't see yet the purification offering, and that's where Moses goes next. So what happens in 16?
He looks for it and he can't find it. It's burned up and he was angry about that.
Yes. Oh, so the other 2 sons of Aaron, they burned up all the meat instead of eating it, and Moses is understandably a little upset that the priests haven't done what the Lord commanded them to do. So he's like, why didn't they eat it? Why didn't they eat it in the courtyard as they were commanded? Because the sacrifice is most holy, and it's intended to take away the guilt of the community by making atonement for them before the Lord. And if they mishandle the people's purification offering, that's not a small thing for either the priest or for the people. And he adds, if the blood of the offering had been used to purify the inside of the tabernacle, that would be different. Then the meat wouldn't be eaten. We saw that back in chapter 6. If the blood is taken inside the tabernacle, then it's not eaten. But that wasn't the case here. The blood wasn't taken inside the tabernacle, so the meat should have been eaten as the Lord commanded them. How does Aaron reply to that in verse 19?
He asks if God would have been pleased if he'd eaten the sacrifice. At this point, he's a little gun shy.
Mm-hmm. The implication of that question being that the Lord would not have been pleased if he had eaten it, right? It's an interesting answer because it turns out that Aaron's failure to eat the meat of the purification offering isn't because he doesn't fear the Lord, it's because he does. So on the particular day when the purification offering, the burnt offering, have been made for the people to inaugurate the worship at the tabernacle, it's not a small thing that 2 of the priests who are supposed to represent them just got struck dead. So even though the priests are given the meat of the purification offering as their rightful portion, it's inappropriate, Aaron says, for him and his sons to eat that symbol of purification given what just happened. Now, let me give you an illustration. I read this story on the Cowboy State Daily a month or 6 weeks ago or something about this family in Rock Springs who something happened to them where they're suing a big company, and they hired this fancy law firm like in Florida or California or somewhere to represent them in court. So there was this lawyer from the law firm who was putting together the arguments to present, the initial arguments to present to the judge with his briefing and all that kind of thing. Well, he used AI to do a whole lot of his prep without realizing that AI could fabricate stuff. So he depends on AI to help him with put all of this stuff together, and then he goes before the judge with his first, preliminary arguments and his briefing and all that. So the judge is reading through it, and he realizes right off the bat there's a bunch of cases that are being quoted that don't actually exist. Like it's fake. It's all fake, and the lawyer didn't know it. He didn't do it on purpose, but he's brought a bunch of false case law, right? And the judge, he got mad. He got super mad. He laid into that law firm. He fined the lawyer like $3,000 or something. I mean, it was a big deal. He just let him have it. Why? Because the lawyer's incompetence puts his client on the wrong side of the court, right? He's there to represent his client, and he's not doing that if he's doing stuff that puts him on the wrong side of the judge. Now, when I read that, I thought, if I were the client, I would be saying to that law firm, if I didn't fire him, which is what I'd be tempted to do, the next thing I'd say is, you had better not be charging me for the time that lawyer spent putting together a whole case that jeopardized everything we're doing right here. There might be other things I pay you for, but you better not be billing me for that time. Because he just jeopardized my whole case by his own incompetence. I think that's what's going on right here. That Aaron is looking at this whole situation, the purification offering that's offered on behalf of the people. The meat that's left from that offering is essentially the payment for the priests. Who is it who just jeopardized the whole nation? The priests. And so it's like Aaron, as the head of the law firm, Aaron is the one who steps up and says, how is it right for us to benefit from the people's purification offering? given the fact that it's the priest who just transgressed against the holiness of the Lord. I mean, doesn't that seem like a logical thing for Aaron to say, this isn't right, it's not right for us to get paid, essentially. When what we did, what the priest did, even though Aaron didn't do it, it's the priesthood who just jeopardized the whole nation by what they did. So Aaron says, would the Lord have been pleased with us, with me, if we had eaten that, if we had taken the payment, given what just happened with his two sons? No. Which is why he had his other sons take it outside, take the rest of the purification offering outside, and burn it up instead. And how does Moses respond to that?
He says, okay.
He says, okay. I think Moses right there realizes the logic of what Aaron is saying, and that he recognizes, again, it's not because Aaron's being flippant. It's because Aaron realizes the seriousness of what the priest just did, and how disrespectful it would be to take the people's purification offering and eat it after what his sons just did.
Which is, when you taught somebody something and they take it to the next step, it's huge.
Isn't it encouraging to see him discerning that? For him to see, to be able to discern, okay, we have to take responsibility for what just happened to the nation, and think again about the whole episode with the golden calf.
Yeah.
How Aaron is doing something very different now, where he's not just going along with whatever the people want. He's not being led along by somebody else. He's stepping up and taking responsibility, saying, okay, the priests have to, we can't get compensated when we just endangered the nation. Good for him, Hooray for Aaron for discerning that and doing what was right. Okay, now, how are any of those things relevant to us?
These are the ways of what we're told. Trust and obey, there's no other way.
Well, again, the words of Hebrews 12 seem very applicable. Let us worship the Lord with reverence and awe, for our Lord is a consuming fire. And he doesn't say our Lord was a consuming fire. He says that our Lord is a consuming fire. Let me read one last quote for you. Leviticus 9 and 10 together portray both the blessedness of Israel's access to the Lord as well as the depth of danger that access has created for the people. Both of these episodes are necessary to appreciate the implications for Israel's newfound nearness to the divine presence. Either chapter without the other would preclude emphasis on what is central in regard to Israel's religion, namely, that the only way of approaching the Lord is the way that he himself has opened by his revelation to Moses. Okay, now, that's interesting because the way that he's opened, the revelation of the way that he's opened, is not an end in itself, it's a foreshadow of someone else, right? So what you're getting in all of these sacrifices is the implication that how is it that you approach a holy God? How do we come to a holy God? Through Jesus. The way that's being revealed is through Jesus. Okay, now back to what you asked, Susan. Why is God so lenient now? Is he lenient? Or has his judgment been poured out on someone else? That's the difference, is that we come to God, we come to a holy God through the mediation of Jesus as the perfect high priest and the sinless sacrifice. So, I mean, last week we were talking about Jesus being your burnt out spot, right? That Jesus being the place where you stand, where when the judgment of God comes, you don't get consumed because Jesus got consumed in your place. That's why we don't get consumed, is because Jesus got consumed for us. And we're going to see that carry on in the next several chapters of Leviticus, this idea of Jesus being your substitute, Jesus taking your place, Jesus trading places with you, Jesus taking the curse that you deserve, Jesus taking the death that you deserve, Jesus standing in the gap, not just to represent you as the high priest, but to take the penalty for your sin as the sacrifice. So it's not that, it's interesting when you get to the gospel accounts where Leviticus stands in the background of what's going on. So for example, when you get to things about a man who has a skin disease, and he comes in and Jesus touches him, right, and heals him right there. Why is it that the man gets healed instead of getting destroyed if Jesus is a holy God? Because the destruction is going to be absorbed by Jesus himself. That's why. Because Jesus is he's going to trade places with the guy. He's going to trade places with us, and he's going to take the destruction we deserve so that our uncleanness gets destroyed, but we don't. So we'll talk more about that in the next several chapters. But all of this is a foreshadow of what it is that Christ has done for us. And God is still just as dangerous if you come to him without a sacrifice. If you come to him without the sacrifice, you will become the sacrifice, right? I mean, you can approach a holy God apart from Jesus, but you don't want to. Because if you do, you're going to pay for your own sins. You're going to be consumed by the holiness of God. The reason we aren't is because Jesus was consumed in our place. All right. Any last comments? Anything you want to add?
My study Bible kind of said that Aaron was sorrowful because his children had died and just didn't feel like eating, and kind of made an excuse because he was grieving, and why would I eat when I'm grieving? And Moses just kind of let it go because he felt bad for him or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a little bit different take on that.
And the reason, I don't normally do this with study Bibles, but the reason I disagree with that is because of what Aaron says in the middle of verse 19, when he says, or the end of verse 19. He doesn't say, such as things as this have happened to me and I don't feel like eating, which I'm sure he doesn't.
Yeah.
But what he says is, would the Lord have been pleased if I had eaten the sin offering today? I think that's the motivation for Aaron, is not how he feels, but he knows that if he eats it, the Lord's going to be displeased with him.
That one sounds like a touchy-feely thing.
Well, and I would have lost my appetite too, but
Yeah.
but that's the goal. The issue isn't whether you feel like eating it or not. The issue is, are you taking seriously the fact that the priests they just endangered the whole community? That's and what would the Lord be pleased with right here?
Okay.
I have to be honest with you, I thought that too, when he was silent, because he just lost his kids.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so thank you, I really brought that out.
And that was from the John MacArthur Study Bible. He's not usually touchy.
No, he did not at all, and I have that in mind, but I didn't put his Bible.
It just goes to show us that our biblical scholars are human beings.
Yeah.
All right. We will stop there.